Welcome to SpyCast, the official podcast of the International Spy Museum. I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Hammond, the museum's historian and curator. Every week, we explore some aspect of the past, present, or future of intelligence and espionage. If you enjoy the show, please consider leaving us a 5-star review. It will take literally less than a minute of your time, and it will really help other listeners to find us. Coming up next on SpyCast.
The open source community can oftentimes deliver information faster, cheaper, and just as good as something that might take weeks and a lot more resources to accomplish in a classified, from a very exquisite collection perspective.
The rise of open source intelligence, that is, information publicly or commercially available online, is being described as an intelligence revolution. To be sure, open source intelligence was conducted way back. For example, by the Allies during World War II, reading German newspapers, listening to the radio, and so forth. But the digital age has meant that volumes of information previously undreamed of now exist on the internet. To further explore the past, present, and future of open source intelligence, or as it is called in the digital age, OSINT, I was joined by Jason Barrett, the current Open Source Intelligence Executive at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. He's the first person to ever hold this role, speaking to the growing importance of OSINT to the American intelligence community and beyond. Jason's career in intelligence has spanned 2 decades, ranging from serving as an analyst in the Defense Intelligence Agency, to being the unit chief of the FBI Cyber Division, and even serving as a presidential daily briefer to the National Security Advisor. In this week's episode, we discuss historical examples of OSINT, the evolution of open source intelligence, the challenges and unique opportunities OSINT presents, and the future of OSINT within the intelligence community. The original podcast on intelligence since 2006, we are SpyCast. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Well, thanks ever so much for joining me, Jason. I'm really looking forward to speaking to you about open source intelligence.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk, and we're excited.
I think a good place to start off would be, sometimes people say to me, when has intelligence ever really mattered? Give us an example where we can see how it's really counted in the world. So I quite often offer the example of the Battle of Midway, where the cracking of JN-25, the Japanese naval code, allowed a smaller and less experienced US Navy to ambush and defeat the Japanese Navy and really turn the tide in the Pacific, as we all know now. Is there some kind of example of open source intelligence that can help people that are maybe new to the term to get their heads around it?
Yeah, sure. And I appreciate the question. If you look back at the history of the intelligence community, you look at almost every decade, there are really strong examples of how open source intelligence has provided not just leading edge indicators, but has provided oftentimes the bulk of our knowledge base when it comes to certain topics. So take, for instance, in the 40s, right after World War II, there was a growing need for more insight into what was going on in the Far East. And there was an interest in, at least within the DC area, of doing more analytic production and in development on, kind of how the world was evolving at that point. And if you really go back and look at the archives within the IC, what you'll see is a strong interest in analysis on Japan and on the region and how Reconstruction was going and different post-war efforts were going, but really poor analysis by the IC and by, frankly, our counterparts over in the UK. And a critique that ended up coming from one sinologist up at Harvard who expressed his frustration with the poor analysis that he was seeing from some of the allies, frankly. And he expressed that frustration to William Donovan, the head of the OSS at the time, right before it became CIA. And in the course of that exchange, Donovan then turned around and actually said, all right, well, why don't you go and help us figure this out? Because during the exchange of information, what he had actually said to Donovan was, if your folks actually did more careful scrutiny of what the Japanese press was actually saying, they would have a much better understanding of the day-to-day life and insights, in the region. And you could get as much, if not more, fidelity on the environment there through careful scrutiny of the press that would offer the right context. Again, after hearing that and understanding this individual's expertise and the fact that he was teaching at Harvard, Donovan then hired him and sent him out there. And ultimately he spent, I believe, nearly 50 years working on behalf of, or in some way, shape, or form with the U.S. government in that way. And if you fast forward to the 60s, the open source intelligence was making up roughly 75%. There are various estimates from individuals at the time that open source intelligence was making up between 75 to 90% of the bulk of U.S. knowledge, U.S. intelligence knowledge when it came to Soviet activity. And so I think it gives you a sense of, over time, the importance of having not just fidelity of what's freely available out there, but it's super important to have the context. If you aren't able to describe the context in which something is happening, you're not going to be able to really have credibility in the story. And so one of the things that really comes through when you look back at, again, the archives for the U.S. Intelligence community is the importance, not just from a foundational perspective, but the majority of our knowledge base and how it is built on that open source context.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you mentioned Donovan. I came across this quote by Donovan, even a regimented press will again and again betray their nation's interests to a painstaking observer. So if you just watch patiently and listen, stuff gets divulged almost despite themselves.
That's a great example. Case in point of just careful observation, right? And it doesn't take someone sitting in a skiff, a secure compartmented room. You could be sitting anywhere, frankly, and just observing. But also, I think what that speaks to is the ability to be able to understand in the local language what's going on in certain circumstances. Right. So technology is evolving to the point at which there's going to be, or there already is, real-time translation capabilities. But if you don't understand the local context, you're not able to really fully appreciate the story. And so having the language and the linguistic capability and the ability to also listen in on those news reports or to read news articles, that is such a critical element to, I think, the story of open source over the last 70 years.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because this is almost a kind of anthropological or area studies sort of take on it, a deep immersion in a cultural context, an understanding of the language. These are preconditions for really understanding what's going on. But you don't hear those things that often when you hear people talk about OSINT. It's more just people sitting in front of computers that could be it could be anywhere, and they're just like consuming, data, which makes it sound very neutral. But you're saying that there can be something deeper going on there.
I think there absolutely can be. But if you also look at open source work and the intelligence community, the evolution of our work has really tracked with technology over the last 70 years. So Obviously, you look in the 40s and open source at the time, the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, which is the predecessor ultimately to what is now the open source enterprise. At the time, it was focused on shortwave radio. And that was how you got most of, from a technological perspective, insight in near real time to what was going on. Obviously, you could get newspaper articles, but the timeliness of them was lacking, and it would oftentimes take days, weeks, to be able to get the print copy back to the DC area. But shortwave radio was different. You're able to get a little bit more fidelity much faster. And if you track that over time, and especially in harder to collect on locations, the Soviet bloc in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, certain places and on into the 80s, certain places were extremely difficult to penetrate when it came to traditional types of clandestine collection. But there was always a need for propaganda, right? And for a really good analyst who understands the region or the country, to be able to understand linguistically what's going on, understanding over time how the story is evolving, how the propaganda is evolving, understand how pictures are depicting certain important, the importance of certain individuals. All of those things together can portray a really important story. And having that context is critical and doesn't require, again, penetrating some impossible or extremely difficult country from a clandestine perspective. But what it does do is it also arms individuals who do that kind of work with much better context so they can operate much more effectively in the clandestine space. So I think that's the other part here is, from a collection perspective, open source intelligence is hugely relevant to policymakers without going through anything else. So we should be able to turn around into an analytic product and provide that context to policymakers in rapid time. But it is also useful in feeding all of the other intelligence disciplines because it allows them to, whether it's signals intelligence and tipping and queuing, what the signals intelligence architecture is doing, or whether it is geospatial and some of the commercial capabilities that have been developed and how that is helping inform then what we do on the sensitive side, or whether that is human and being able to arm our case officers and our assets with more context. It's just a hugely important element to all of that.
Mm-hmm. I think it would be useful at this point just to go up to 30,000 feet. So just for anybody that is trying to orientate themselves within this conversation, when we speak about open source intelligence or OSINT, what exactly are we talking about?
So we released about 2 months ago the first intelligence community open source strategy. And at the very beginning of that strategy, you'll see a definition of open source intelligence that is new for the IC. And it specifically says open source intelligence is information derived exclusively from publicly and commercially available information. Why is that relevant to anybody? Well, historically, people have always understood, or those who have followed the intelligence community have understood that open source intelligence is publicly available, right? And I think the open source community of today, even outside of government, is quite passionate about what that means. But within the IC, it's really important that commercial information also be specifically called out because in today's world, it is increasingly relevant to the work that we do. It is also purchasable by anyone with the resources that might be required, but anyone could go purchase certain types of commercial data sets. And so in our view, that is also an open source kind of a stream of information. And so when you think about, in the macro sense, all of the different types of information that might fall within open source intelligence, You've got, obviously, the traditional news. You've got social media. You've got the national news of various countries, the official news outlets, the unofficial news outlets, the traditional print media, the new media. You've also then got a variety of other types of data. And in this sense, I would start to look at it from in a layered perspective, right? So what I've just talked about is really the obvious layer of information. But then if you look at, and that's the stuff that you could search on the internet and anybody could go and easily do that without really, frankly, having to apply any sort of tradecraft.
It's indexed, that's on Google.
Sure.
You can find it all from that browser.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think if you step then below that, that's really where you're going to start to get into the OSINT practitioner wheelhouse. So anybody can do the other stuff. And a lot of people do, and they don't even realize they're doing it, right? That's open source, kind of study. But when you get into open source intelligence and the real practitioners in the IC, what you're talking about there is the ability to then get into the deep web. Not the dark web, the deep web. So certain types of forms, files, company information, filings. You're getting into certain government data that has been posted online, but people just don't realize it. It's more obscure. You're getting into, again, a variety of different subscription services even at that point. And that would comprise the deep, what oftentimes is euphemistically referred to as the deep web, but it is enormous. And frankly, it's where the bulk of the information is that makes up the broad internet. It's just also an area where most people don't go because they don't see a day-to-day need for it. But that information is oftentimes critical to piecing together a story. In particular, if someone is interested in so let's say a picture is posted online and it has to do with an individual that we're really interested in. We want to be able to understand the full context of that picture, what's behind it, what's in there, what are the insignias, and going through all different parts of that photo, not just the human element, but everything, the objects around it. There's so many different threads you can pull, and then being able to then do the research on what some of those things signify. It might take you down certain rabbit holes in the deep web that ultimately you're able to realize, oh, wait, that insignia means they work for that department. That department has certain filings that we can get to. So there's and they're all publicly available. You just have to have the wherewithal to find that, figure that out. So I think there's been some phenomenal work outside of government from a nonprofit or journalistic perspective in this space. A huge growth industry in this area from just volunteers as well as journalists. But we have a pretty good cadre of folks across the IC and DoD who are doing this work as well.
Mm-hmm. I was just thinking of a couple of examples of OSINT that came to mind when you were talking there. One was, I remember reading that during the Second World War, apparently some British analysts would read the Berlin newspapers and they would see which operas had been cancelled. And from that, they would infer how effective some of the bombing raids over Berlin were. Because if it was targeting the right areas, for example, then that meant that it was effective. But if it wasn't, then they needed to adjust how they were bombing. And then a more recent example, in the war in Ukraine, this Russian submarine commander posts his Strava heat maps of where he's running, and let's just say he's no longer with us.
Right.
So those are the kinds of things that it can be used for, right? It's kind of fascinating, really, when you think about it. And these are examples that are on the surface. They're not submerged. We're talking about a newspaper. We're talking about a Strava heat map that's just out there for anybody to find on Google. So it's kind of fascinating, right?
Well, and it's a good example of how, in certain cases, you can get to the answer much faster and far cheaper and much more effectively using publicly available, commercially available information. And, the other thing that it really jumps off the page when you research over the last, 70 years, very passionate OSINT practitioners, as well as people who've been in very senior positions across the U.S. government. What is a consistent theme? You can almost hear it every decade is the volume of information is more than we've ever had it, right? It's greater than it's ever been. And it's just impossible to really sift through it all. And if people just realize that 80% of the information base for the IC is open source, man, this would be so much more heavily invested in. And you could invest in it in a way that would deliver a return on investment that was significant, frankly, compared to maybe some of the more expensive work that we do in the classified realm. But I think what is also clear is that it's not an either-or situation. You can't just invest in classified to the detriment of open source intelligence work, or you can't just say that open source could get you the 80% solution, so why are we even doing the classified work? There's got to be a balance. And I think we've struggled with that as an intelligence community over the last 60 to 70 years. There have been times when it has been leaned on heavily, more so than anything else. But there's been, periods, long periods, where it's been, frankly, under-supported, underdeveloped. And I think now we've got an opportunity in the last year, and frankly, looking forward, to really think about how to set the IC up for success long term, and do so in a way that delivers for the taxpayer. And that's that's frankly what I'm focused on, is how are we using taxpayer dollars the most effectively? How can we ensure that we're delivering for the American people in a way that they would be proud of, but also protects their privacy, right? And that's why the work that we do is focused on our adversaries and areas where, frankly, U.S. intelligence does not have a huge footprint, because we just we have to prioritize some of our more exquisite collection. But there's opportunities there for us to not be surprised by events that emerge maybe in developing nations or developing parts of the world.
In thinking about open source intelligence, I'd like you to take a massive step back to think about the interrelationship between humanity, information, and technology. Our existence and the narrative arc of our species has always been conditioned by the information that we have about the world around us, which in turn has been conditioned by the technology available for the dissemination of that information. We can think about the modern digital age, but we can also think about the revolution ushered in by the invention of the printing press, or the Gutenberg press, invented by the German craftsman Johannes Gutenberg in 1455, which radically changed the distribution and flow of information for our species. This in turn had all kinds of knock-on effects. Formerly laborious, time-consuming, and therefore very expensive, book printing can now be done at a much greater scale, in a timely manner, and at a very low cost. The sheer volume of books in circulation would quickly go from thousands to millions to billions. This affected the Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution, mass literacy, political discourse, the economic system, the development of the nation state, and much more besides. It is a press, certainly, Gutenberg said, but a spring of truth shall flow from it. Like a new star, it shall scatter the darkness of ignorance and cause a light hitherto unknown to shine amongst men. Now think about this statement in the context of contemporary debates surrounding misinformation disinformation, and information warfare. I think it would be good just briefly. Could you tell our listeners the difference between commercially available information and publicly available information? I know it sounds kind of obvious, but just a few sentences.
Yeah, so publicly available information is information that anyone could obtain through print, traditional media sources. We're talking about TV, internet, the online news, books, if you were to go to the library, those types of things. It also covers a whole range of other content when it comes to what people have posted online, and kind of the let's call it blogs, or the whole range of content on the internet that is kind of easily searchable or requires some additional kind of OSINT related tools. But we're talking about the stuff that comes to mind for everybody: news, media, print, and then the various rabbit holes you can go down on the internet. Commercial data, on the other hand, is data that comes out of the industry. It comes out of private industry, and there has been an explosion of it over the last 15 to 20 years as companies start to have realized that the value of the information that they are obtaining every single day from users, from mobile phone users, from desktop computer users, from proprietary data sources, it's all going different places, and then it's being repackaged and sold, and is available for purchase. There is understandably really, I would think, I think passionate views on the value of this information and the need to protect people's privacy. We agree entirely with that. We also agree, though, that as long as the current environment is the way it is, and this data is being sold to anyone, that includes our adversaries. Whether or not it's direct or through cutouts, it is available for sale. And so it's really important that we have a sense not of what Americans are doing, but what we can understand from our adversaries and from the environment in which our adversaries are operating. And so this is hugely important to the work we do, not just in the open source community, but it's frankly important and foundational to the work that all of the intelligence community is doing across all intelligence disciplines. So without that insight, we would be at a significant deficit.
So for the commercially available information, is that something that like a listener could get a hold of, or is this type of stuff only sold to other companies or to governments, or is it entities that are on a particular legal footing, or just anybody who has the money can get access to this? So it's literally completely open source.
Yeah, the vast majority of it is purchasable by anyone. And I think that's really important to underscore because there is this sense that some may be concerned that the intelligence community is only getting stuff that nobody else could get, and that we're circumventing privacy protections in order to do that. And that's just not the case. We are operating in a legal space. We welcome additional discussions on what this means and what it looks like to protect privacy rights in going forward over the next 10 years. But that is a discussion that is bigger than just us. I think the American people are increasingly aware of how much data they are giving away every single day. And this is why you've seen growing interest in Europe, in the US, and elsewhere in better informing customers of the tools that they're using and the capabilities that they obviously appreciate. But the flip side is how that is informing not just governments, but frankly, that is informing how companies are marketing to them, how they're selling them certain types of information. So again, there's commercial data, but there's also commercial platforms, right? And so what we don't want to do is spend taxpayer dollars building in-house capabilities that, frankly, the commercial side and industry can build faster, often times cheaper, and many times better than what we might be able to do within government. And so we oftentimes partner with commercial entities who have not just data but platforms that are depicting that information, visualizing that information for us in a much more powerful way. So it allows us to cut through and filter certain types of things and really get to the bottom line faster.
So with open source intelligence, I spoke to someone a couple of years ago on the podcast. Don't need to go into who, but they're former CIA and they now work in the commercial space. And they said that with around 200 people, we can probably get about 80% of what the IC could get just by doing OSINT. So to me, the IC needs to be reformed so that the IC is got the people that are getting the 80%, but the vast majority of it needs to be reorientated towards the 20%. Is that I know that's that's like a big debate there, but I just wondered if you had any like thoughts on that as the OSINT guy at ODNI.
So the short answer is the way with data volumes growing the way they are, and the ability to gather as much as we have at our fingertips now, we could probably recreate the majority of the information for the IC. What we could not do, however, which is kind of the key part that I think people would miss in that debate, or at least initially, is the most exquisite insights are oftentimes the things that are going to give us the actual context that is important, or the missing piece of whatever we don't have in that open source world. And vice versa. But you can't do one or the other. It's got to be both. But to the argument that was made by your previous interviewee, it is something that I am pretty passionate about when it comes to how we are allocating our resources. If you look at how the USIC is allocating resources, I think there is a huge opportunity for growth that is responsible and does not cost, or costs a fraction of what it would be in other intelligence disciplines, but responsible growth within the open source community that would at the same time allow us to have a more distributed workforce, to be more transparent to the American people, because of the maturity of what we would be trying to strive for. And it would give us, frankly, the ability to have a more diverse workforce from who we're hiring, because there are certain things that maybe we don't have to worry about near as much if we're having a distributed workforce working open source issues. So I think there's huge opportunities there. It is a classic DC thing, where we have to say, just give us more instead of let's be more thoughtful about it. This is a good time to really think about what are we trying to accomplish, right? And if our business in the intelligence world, and it is a business in to some extent, is knowledge. Intelligence is knowledge. If you look at the father of the intelligence community's analytic tradecraft, Sherman Kent, his quote, in one of his earlier writings is, Intelligence is knowledge. Well, knowledge without credibility means very little. So what we are offering to our customers is not just the knowledge, but the credibility that comes with that knowledge. That's the only reason we have cachet. If we don't have credibility in what we're saying, we don't have anything. We don't have access. And so if we could get the vast majority of our knowledge and our intelligence from open source, that the policymakers don't care. Our warfighters don't care. What they want is accuracy and credibility. And if we can do that and do it through open source and save more money or save money, period, in a comparative sense, we should be thinking about that. And we should really think through what it means to orient the IC long-term towards that goal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering as well if there's also opportunities to, whether it be time or cost or just, duplication, if you want to put it like that. So across the different intelligence agencies, we could think of, say, the DIA and the CIA, the DIA and the CIA. If you have maybe, in the old system where you have them, there's maybe a degree of, I'm not saying those agencies specifically, I'm just using them as an example, but imagine there's a degree of mistrust. This is our turf, this is what we do, that's your turf, that's what you do, etc. And then they generate products and that gives a general picture. And there's pieces of it where people are doing things that are very rare or exceptional or unique or that are exquisite. Across both of them. So I guess the question is, if you're doing it open source and it's something that can just be pulled across the whole IC, listen, it's literally open source. So you don't need to do that any longer. We don't all need to do the same thing and for it to be hid behind paywalls or stovepipes or however you want to describe it. So therefore, that's something that we can all really forget about. It's something that is getting taken care of. Let's just say it's some interagency group that's taking care of all of that. Our sole purpose now is to focus on that 20%. Like, what is it uniquely that DIA can deliver for the 20%? What is it uniquely that CIA can deliver? What is it uniquely that NSA can deliver or whatever? So I guess I'm just saying, is there a way to also eliminate some redundancy or some duplication of effort? I'm guessing the answer is yes.
Well, we've had no choice. To be honest with you, burden sharing in the open source space has been literally what we've needed to do because we didn't have a choice. There has been, I think, challenges in the relationships between the different agencies over the last decade or two. It is one of the reasons why my position exists at all. So it's a brand new position that was created, last year. I started in October. I'm the first IC OSINT executive, but I'm really privileged because my partners at CIA and DIA, my counterparts, Randy and Brad, we have really developed a close working relationship. Everybody understands the importance of what we're doing, and we're passionate about the work. We also understand that the only way we're going to generate buy-in and appreciation for the need to mature the enterprise through financial support or greater role is if people see us, not just internally, but on the Hill and elsewhere, really putting into practice this burden sharing concept. So there is, I think, when we've had these conversations with staffers on the Hill, we have really worked hard over the last year to identify ways in which we are not duplicating effort. And in fact, we're synchronizing the activities so that, DIA's effort is feeding into CIA's effort, and then I'm able to help or work with both in certain circumstances. But I also think it's important that people understand that those two, CIA in particular is the largest open source element for the IC. DIA is the next largest, both from a resourcing and a staffing perspective. But if you look out across the IC, we've got some phenomenal work going on at different IC elements, both. If you look at state INR and the strategy that they just released, I was really happy to see that, and I think it really hits at the importance and the impact that open source information and intelligence can offer to diplomacy efforts. But the Army and the Air Force have been long-standing open source partners for decades, and in some cases, the work that they've been doing has been cutting edge and leading edge for the entire IC in this space. The translation work that they did in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the technical collections that they both, the Air Force in particular, has. These are critical components to our larger knowledge base. And one of the things that we are stressing in the work and in our strategy that we're putting together is it's really important that we leverage all of what is available now. Instead of building out duplicative lines of effort, let's make our dollar go farther. And I think we're getting there. One area that we still have room to grow, and it's not just the open source community, but it's across the IC, is working with commercial partners and industry partners. So we are really trying to rethink how we are acquiring commercially available information so that we're not across the IC purchasing the same data multiple times. And in fact, we're not just having single contracts, right? But we're finding ways to use a single touch point to hit hundreds of companies. It's really important that we think differently about how we are using our resources to acquire the information we need, and that we are doing due diligence to make sure that the information we're getting is actually what we need.
One major problem of the modern age for open source intelligence analysts is the explosion of information. And when I say explosion, I mean explosion with a capital E. The Library of Congress is the world's largest library, with over 175 million items in its collection, including over 25 million books. The entire printed collection of the library would take up approximately 10 terabytes. Yet, around 403 terabytes of information are created every single day. To put this in context, each day, over 40 times the volume of data contained by the world's largest library is created. That's 282 times that library every week and 14,700 times that library every year. Imagine trying to stay on top of all of that information. But also, imagine the picture of the world you can build up if you can mine this information effectively. This is the challenge the intelligence community faces today. I was just wondering as well, just for our listeners, so that they can get their head around open source. So I'm just thinking of sources and methods. So the sources, you've helpfully explained that they're open. Does that mean that the methods also have to be open, or can they sometimes be closed? So I'm thinking you can release the report, but you don't necessarily have to say this is the specific thing we did. I mean, there might even be some hack of how you can find information that the other side doesn't know about. And it's not that it's a big secret, but you're just we would actually just prefer to keep our, we've got a talented team that are leveraging information in unique ways, and we would just rather keep that to ourselves for a while, if that's okay with everyone. Help me understand the difference between sources and methods and OSINT.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I've given this a lot of thought, and I think what's really, is a misnomer is that the tradecraft itself is classified. In a lot of ways, the tradecraft, even sensitive aspects of it, is very consistent with what any high-level outside expert, the same tradecraft that they would apply if they were trying to pursue a story. And it required them to be very sensitive to their target's ability to track them, right? So we want to be very careful that we are not, through our tradecraft, divulging what our interests are. I think what is sensitive is the who, the what, the why. Who are we interested in? What are we interested in, and why? How we get that information is less, I would say, classified than it is. We don't need to really go through all of the intricate details, but I would just say it's not particularly sensitive in the sense that it's unique to just the IC. Anybody who wants to go out and collect information on another person could apply many of the same tradecraft, same tradecraft practices. But the difference is that's a private citizen doing that, right? As opposed to the U.S. government. And in that sense, we have to be very careful that we apply our tradecraft against the right places, people, and for the right reasons that are legal. And so that, I think, is what is important. When you're talking about sources and methods and tradecraft, our approach needs to be consistent with U.S. law. It needs to be consistent with IC policy. And we don't want to divulge through sloppy tradecraft who we're interested in and why, right? Because maybe we've been tasked with something to find out more information on what's going on in a certain country or, between certain individuals. We need to be able to do that in a way that is circumspect, but allows us to get the answer fast. And so we can do that, but we have to apply sometimes some obfuscation in our collection. And you can do that in an open source world without tripping into that clandestine, classified space.
And I'm just thinking more broadly as well now. So open source intelligence, how much, if at all, is that an equalizer? So for example, I'm a small country. I can't put satellites in space. I can't develop planes that are going to fly 80,000 feet, but with a few hundred people that are well trained, I can do OSINT pretty well. Is there a sense that for countries like that, they can now punch a little bit more above their weight compared to the past when things were different, or is it? I mean, there's obviously the United States is a big country with a lot of money and a lot of people on this thing, so there actually is economies of scale, and when you have a lot of people working on this, you can do way more than you can't. Respectfully, small country, I like what you're doing, but you're not going to get close to what we are doing because of just the size and the resources and so forth. Help me understand that kind of, is it an equalizer, or how does it affect the equilibrium of global politics, I guess, is the question.
So it's an equalizer in the sense that it would give smaller countries a greater ability to understand the threats to them, but it may not give them, to your point, the ability to go engage everywhere else, maybe like we do, like the U.S. and our allies have the ability to do. So that scale, that economy of scale that you're talking about, gives us the ability to have a global footprint and coverage and awareness that could not be replicated by a smaller country. But maybe that country, because of just dealing with less threats, has the ability to, through, from an open source perspective, they have a much easier ability to have indicators and warning of potential threats to them, because they can spend their relatively smaller resources compared to us through open source intelligence. And so I think that is definitely a truism, but I wouldn't just put the smaller countries into that category. What's interesting is just the growth of non-state entities in general. So when you think about corporations, multinational companies, the ability to understand what's going on, in many cases, some of those organizations are larger than many countries, right? And if they want to, they could put together an intelligence picture that helps inform them in a number of ways that is very similar to the approach that we would be interested in. So I think that is a growing area of importance for people to realize, and it has certain implications. But I think the other thing that I would add to this conversation is one of the areas that I'm interested in really accentuating with the open source community is the ability to develop common bonds and transparency. So it's really important as we go through updating our USIC standards and our overarching kind of approach to how we do open source intelligence and the standards that we apply, the methodology, so to speak, that we apply. We have an opportunity to really be transparent about that. Maybe we can't open back up everything from a production standpoint that we are producing, but we can certainly be more transparent about how we're doing it. And I think there's an opportunity there to establish more of a consistent approach like the open source community does outside of government, where they're working in a much more transparent sense and towards, common with a common purpose. And I think when we're living in an age when credibility and trust is really important to build, this is an opportunity for the IC to really build that trust, I think, in important ways. So it's an area I think you will see more of, being more transparent in our work. And that, I think, offers a huge juxtaposition when you look at how many of the authoritarian regimes are moving and operating. So our Chinese counterparts are closing walls, right? And making it harder for people to understand what's going on a day-to-day basis, and even internally. And what we want to do is we want to show people the benefit of Western democracy and the freedom and the transparency that comes with that.
And one thing that I wanted to ask was, it's obvious that you're really passionate about open source intelligence, and I feel like most of the people that I speak to who are involved in open source intelligence, they almost have a slight, in the best sense of the term, a slight evangelical kind of component to them. Like, what is it about open source intelligence that sort of that really, does it for you? Why do you find it so compelling and so interesting?
It gets back to this idea that, so I've served as a presidential daily briefer for the National Security Advisor. I've worked for the DNI as an exec across multiple different administrations. I've seen the most sensitive information that the IC has for years, and we have, some of that stuff is why I wanted to join the IC in the first place. Okay. There is nothing quite like being able to deliver to the National Security Advisor on a car ride down to the White House information that's going to really change the course of how they are going to operate that day and potentially help impact decision-making from an administration's perspective, and to represent the IC when you're doing that. But I also have seen that the open source community can oftentimes deliver information faster, cheaper, and just as good as something that might take weeks and a lot more resources to accomplish in a classified, from a very exquisite collection perspective. And back to my earlier comment, policymakers don't care. That we don't get brownie points for going the hardest route possible to get the information. What they want to know is that what the intelligence community is providing is credible and that it's accurate, and it's objective. And if we can do those things, and we can do it through open source intelligence, why aren't we doing that? Of course we should do that more. And I think, for me, I don't know that 10 years ago I would have had the same amount of appreciation for this role as what I do now. But having the experiences that I've had working terrorism and cyber and, supporting national level leaders, you see then where either gaps have occurred or, frankly, where there's an opportunity for cost savings. And I'm excited about the potential to reach the next generation of workforce. If we can do that through the open source, ecosystem, I'm stoked about that. It's a huge opportunity for us. And I think one of the things that has really attracted me to this position is the opportunity that it offers, not just the IC, but policymakers and the warfighter, and to do so without building a bureaucracy that's ridiculous. We can do so with a relatively small footprint. And I think philosophically, I love that idea. What can we do? Where can we really gain the greatest advantage and using the most opportunity, but without a huge footprint? Mm-hmm. And I think this is really where that's at.
Well, thanks ever so much for your time. It's been a pleasure to speak to you.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of SpyCast. Please follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoy the show, please tell your friends and loved ones. Please also consider leaving us a 5-star review. Coming up next week on SpyCast.
So it's all about understanding the world around you. And within it has an awful lot of recipes that are very useful for invisible inks. As he also writes a book on ontology.
If you have feedback, you can reach us by email at spycast@spymuseum.org or on X at INTL-SpyCast. If you go to our page at thecyberwire.com/podcast/SpyCast, you can find links to further resources, detailed show notes, and full transcripts. I'm your host, Andrew Hammond, and my podcast content partner is Erin Dietrich. The rest of the team involved in the show is Mike Mincy, Memphis Von III, Emily Coletta, Emily Renz, Afua Anokwa, Ariel Samuel, Elliot Peltzman, Trey Hester, and Jen Iben. This show is brought to you from the home of the world's preeminent collection of intelligence and espionage-related artifacts, the International Spy Museum.